Thank you. Hello, my name is Benazir Shahril. I'm from Amarta Microfinance, a social enterprise based in Indonesia. I'd like to ask maybe Mr. Mark Pruden and also Mr. John, but also if Ms. Kirsten wants to have an opinion about it, that would be fantastic. So, while Indonesia is indeed one of the world's largest consumer base, we shouldn't overlook the entrepreneurs that is happening in Indonesia. We know that the micro, small, and medium enterprises counts for more than 50% of the GDP. And my question will be, first, has there been any projects that concentrate on providing financial and also capacity building support for the entrepreneurs, especially community-based social entrepreneurships? Because if reverting back to the discussion this morning, if our Australian neighbour feels so uncertain or feels so prudent about putting huge or large investment FDI in Indonesia, maybe through this social investment that maybe the scale may be lower than that, maybe that can be the alternative. And also the second question is there any platform that can connect community entrepreneurs from both countries? Because I think if we want to have people-to-people ties to take place, I think in my opinion, this platform must be there. I think that would be my two main questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Benazir. I'm happy to start with the first question first. And I probably speak most comfortably about the Australian aid program rather than other donors working in Indonesia. AusAid hasn't done very much microfinance or access to finance type work at a subnational level. My understanding of that, and I can't really speak on behalf of AusAid, my understanding of that is that they don't feel that they do that very well, and that's not really their comparative advantage in supporting that type of work, as important as it happens to be. So I think a few years ago, AusAid had a look at themselves and they realised they were trying to spread themselves way too thin and they were trying to focus on way too many sectors, and I think that they've tried to narrow their focus into flagship areas like education and health and so forth. I think that's probably a good idea because there are other donors who do that type of work better. So while I agree with the premise of the question that it's actually really important and valuable, there's probably clearly not enough of that going on currently in Indonesia.
Yeah. Sorry if I may follow up, because one of the examples that the British Council actually have been doing this, they call it Community Entrepreneurship Challenge, for example. So they actually give this competition sort of to those young entrepreneurs, or not even young, just entrepreneurs, to actually give their proposal and see if they can collaborate through that.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite a
yeah, so I know Australia has done a couple of those type of projects. They've done one all over the Pacific, and they did one in Africa. They didn't go very well. I think there's probably a range of reasons for that. So it'll be interesting to see whether the new government actually starts to do more of that type of work, because they've sort of given an indication that that's the type of thing that they'll have a heavier focus on.
Why didn't they go well, Mark?
I don't think, well, my theory on this is that organisations like AusAid actually take quite a long time to build up a body of knowledge, and that was probably a bit of a flagship in that type of area. So I think that they're just at the stage now where they've gone through the first round of that type of activities, and there have been a lot of lessons learnt, some of them just basic implementation, some of them about design. And so I think they're at the current stage where they're reassessing whether they'll reinvest in that area, but I suspect that the new government probably will.
John, did you have any perspective?
Well, I actually wonder about that because, but not that I don't think they should. I think one of the real problems, and I'm not certain, Kirsten, if you might have a view on this, is that the development assistance budget is actually bedevilled by risk avoidance. And that's for understandable reasons, and the culture, therefore, is always about risk avoidance. And the reason I say that is it's the 1%, or even less than the 1%, of money which is poorly spent, which is focused upon, not the 98%, which is, or 80%, which is spent with full probity. And there's a huge fear of, did you provide funds Australian taxpayers' money to a project that went bad, was that called shonks. There's a whole bunch of things. So there's actually kind of like a lot of the necessary risk taking that you need to have to actually work in markets is actually quite difficult to deliver. I must say, I was just trying to think through, and I don't necessarily have a problem about, I mean, it's a structural issue, I don't know, rolling AusAid into foreign affairs, but I think there's actually quite a cultural challenge, I must say. So if you think about it, so just look at Indonesia. So hopefully it's not too micro, but I was just thinking about it when I was coming up today. The actual diplomatic footprint in Indonesia is actually quite significant once you include AusAid in it as well. I mean, it's quite a significant play. And actually in Canberra as well, most of the knowledge actually of contemporary relationships is in AusAid, the DFAT. So who's going to run it? And who's going to be responsible for the expenditure of money? Who's going to sign off on that, on the accountabilities? You know, a DFAT officer, and I think there's a couple here, terrific people, and having been one myself and having been expelled, I'm sure they're outstandingly talented on a continuing basis. Maybe it's got better. But, you know, their knowledge of cash flow, accounting is actually, with all due respect, not core. I mean, policy formation is not core. So you can imagine you actually may see less risk-taking or an environment which is actually built around avoidance. So I'm a little nervous about that. But going specifically to your question, I actually think there's really interesting work taking place on financing of SMMEs and actually on entrepreneurship, and that's actually, it's partly because there's such a big push, and it's for good political reason, on this issue of inclusive growth, where there's a real consciousness that and I think we'll look at this in terms of the Gini differential that's taking place within the region coefficient, when you actually look at the disproportion, where you see, particularly in some economies, where there's a lot more wealth generated for a small group of people compared to a lot of people, which means there's actually a potential political problem. So we're focusing on inclusive growth. And of course, if you think about it, that inclusive growth will come from supporting and stimulating entrepreneurship, and a lot of that will come out of helping develop SMEs and SMMEs. But then, as I said, making it easier to form them, get the look, you know, how long does it take to form a company in Indonesia? I haven't looked at the World Bank Index on this for some time, but I suspect that actually one of the challenges is to bring that down to make the regulatory approvals much lower. That's behind the border reform. And then how do you finance the cash flow? And there's some significant challenges, because if you look at what's happening at the G20 level, one of the most common ways of financing SME trade and SME development is trade finance. I don't know if you watched this, but trade finance is being weighted in terms of risk at the same level as complex derivatives, which means that their availability from a financial point of view will go down and their cost will go up. And of course, that actually funds a lot of SME export activity. So, by the way, I would say Australia and Indonesia at the G20 have an interest in grappling with that issue. So there's lots of things we can do to enlarge the relationship going on.
Kirsten, I can see you scribbling furiously there.
Oh, look, just a couple of comments, and on the social inclusion and microfinance, probably more than social entrepreneurship, but often it's women's projects that are funded as part of that social inclusion, and that's potentially because it actually fits into a defined priority of whoever the donor is. I'm thinking of ADB, but it's often about finding, if you're looking for partnerships and like-minded people, sometimes it's about finding a definition that fits with institutions that are there and involved in the space as well.
Do you think aid that's got more of a business focus is actually going to strengthen the partnership between Australia and Indonesia, as opposed to aid that looks like a handout? It puts it almost on
just the language of the word aid. You know, to me, there's a whole politics around that, and it's not really, as we've talked about the checkbook charity, it's about development assistance or growth assistance or the behind the border reforms or the access to finance or the mentoring or the linkages on that social entrepreneurship or whatever linkages. It comes down to the people.
There's a question up the back, I believe. Russ.
Thanks for your presentations. Given the talk about education and business links, I was just wondering if I could throw an idea out and wonder, could we have a John Denton Scholarship for Indonesian Studies, for someone to do Indonesian studies at a tertiary level.
Money where your mouth is.
Could we
Got-
have
got anyone in mind?
I thought you were going to raise the money. No, I'm happy.
Could we have a Kirsten Sayers Award for the $10,000 to the young Year 12 student who excels at Indonesian? Could we have a Mark Pruden internship for Indonesian engagement in business legal? I'm told we're out of time, so just thumbs up would be okay.
That's right, get everyone involved.
We're out of time.
Short on time.
But to flag that education stuff, but John's doing a lot in education with his team and generally in influencing. And I think, you know, if we look really frankly at education in Australia, you know, I specialised in Chinese language, Chinese law 20 years ago. You know, they thought I was mad, frankly, in Australia. You know, at least 20 years ago, you could probably study more Indonesian than you can now. That's something that needs to be addressed. So to find to someone who would get that Indonesian language award at Year 12, well, that'd be fabulous. You know, even speaking with Grace earlier, she speaks Indonesian. She studied Indonesian at high school. Her school's recently shut down that, which is, you know, really something that we all need to encourage. Learn languages. Get on with it.
Can I just make a comment? Actually, it's interesting. I was asked to speak. I don't know if Chris, you were there, but I actually on the board of AsiaLink, and I was asked to speak at the Australia Education Network. I'd never spoken there before. Last year there were 50 people. This year, and I don't think it's because I was speaking, there were 500 people, principals from across the country in Australia who are looking at how they actually reach out on an educational basis to enlarge the future of their students. It was very exciting, and as I said, you know, political rhetoric will change around Australia and the Asian centre. I'm not really fussed about that. But what I found, and what I've also found, is that through the process of discussing the opportunities for Australia in the Asian century, and by making certain that discussion took place outside Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra. Actually, we went to regional Australia. We went to actually where the money is, by the way, which is Western Australia, Northern Territory and Queensland, because that's where the big engagement really is. We actually started a national conversation. You'd be amazed by the number of emails I received from Australians of Asian origin who were personally thanking me for actually raising their status in the country. Because they said for the first time we're being recognised for the potential we can bring, which I mean was kind of a side. I mean, I didn't actually expect that, but it was actually very interesting. And so there's actually, for whatever politicians might say, there's actually a national dialogue going on about how we can enlarge the future of this country through greater engagement with Asia. What that finally looks like, I don't know, but I'm very attracted to the John Denton Scholarship as an idea fully funded by CAUSINDY, which is the group.
Just on that, with AsiaLink, there's the Asia Literacy Ambassador Network, and I'm sure many of you could play a role in that. And that is about speaking up and advocating for the deeper relationships, the deeper engagement, the language, the culture, and the business links.
I just wanted to touch on something you just said, you mentioned earlier, John, that some of the ways of doing business and barriers to doing business. You mentioned, for instance, it takes quite a long time. I don't know the exact figure myself, but I've read those reports into how long it takes to set up a company in Indonesia. So important to pick your partner. But I was also chatting with someone from the Indonesian embassy yesterday who pointed out that we have a very prohibitive visa scheme for people for Indonesians simply to come to Australia. Some of his family members can't even get a visa, and he's a top diplomat. So what kind of practical steps could be implemented to increase business ties around, around that paperwork, bureaucracy, simple things like visas that perhaps we as Australians hadn't considered?
Well, you give to people mobility, don't you? Then it goes to quite quickly shackles go up because that might mean liberation of migration, and that might actually mean challenges to border security. and all sorts of issues. It gets very quickly reduced from what is a very sensible argument that actually, if you think about regional economic integration, people-to-people movement, particularly if you think about the services economy and those involved, is actually critical. The ease of moving around is critical. I actually worked on a paper with some friends of mine from the Philippines around labour mobility, which is a very sensible paper. As you think about, the Philippines have a particular interest in this, and so do a lot of people in Indonesia as well. Because there's actually a surfeit of labour available, and there's actually a deficit in a number of the more developed economies in the region, and actually sometimes matching that through mobility. It wasn't guest workers, it wasn't about forced migration, etc. It was really about trying to come up with some ways of thinking that through. We took that to the leaders at APEC in Singapore, and the first thing they said, that's actually, we can't talk about that because we're going to get caught in both people discussions. It just went, so my God, I mean, that wasn't, but you think the political rhetoric, it actually requires leaders to change. That's a political issue. And you only change these sorts of things by leaders leading and symbols and language and that sort of stuff, and it actually is a hard battle. I admire enormously the business community and political leadership of Australia in the 60s who were able to do that with Japan. When you think about it, we were one generation out of the potential Japanese occupation of Australia, and yet within that generation, a number of the people were able to show the leadership to actually open up to a comprehensive economic relationship with Japan. That took real leadership. Can't quite see that at the moment.
So, certainly
that's my observation. I'm sure others will disagree.
The APEC cards have gone some way to facilitating some of that
for professionals, but it's pretty hard to get these days.
And it's hard to get them, and they've been sort of clamping down on that in the last couple of years. But part of the discussion that goes with that is the whole cultural side of what constitutes a household. If it's someone going around for work, that's one thing. But I'd like to bring my wife and the kids and the maid and the butler and so then what constitutes a household going, whether that be for a holiday or for work or for immigration, becomes different between the different countries, and again it comes down to national discussions.
Yeah, I think it's probably clear that there are a lot of people who aren't trying to sort of rort the system and bring every sort of person in their extended family here, but they're also being prevented from doing business.
Oh, quite often people come though or want to come with a maid, because for many cultures that's what you do. Yeah, it's a helper.
But I'm just wondering how equal the partnership can be when, for instance, there's totally disequal access to each other's countries. I mean, I'm just presenting something that I heard from someone at the Indonesian embassy that was a huge concern.
Can I just, when was the last time you went to Jakarta or to Bali?
3 months ago.
And did you actually have a visa before you got there? We got a visa on arrival. Yeah, that's right. So it's actually, and that's not because Australians are special and we have to be. That's partly a response to Australia's position on visas for Indonesians. And look how long it takes. If you get caught behind a flight from Qatar and you don't actually have an APEC business card, which has access to Indonesia, you can be stuck in the line for an hour and 20 to 2 hours. The reason I say that's important, I work in professional services where it's all about speed of connectivity. If you lose 2 hours, and also you just don't know, therefore, you think twice. Maybe I'll do the deal in Singapore. I mean, it's actually that's how we kind of think about things at a real level. Yeah.
Okay, is there time for one more question? Yes.
We can do one more and then we'll do the breakout.
Yeah.
I just wanted to talk a little bit more. My name's Courtney. I work in international development, not-for-profit sector. So I just wanted to talk about a little bit more on the future of ODA and with middle-income countries like Indonesia. So there's, so many statistics and a lot of research being done at the moment about the bottom billion people who still live in poverty within middle-income countries. So I was wondering, is there still a role for aid or development assistance, whatever you like to call it, to play in such countries? With Indonesia, even though it's growing so rapidly, there's still 100 million people living below the poverty line. And then with humanitarian disasters, environmental disasters, it's usually these bottom billion that are most strongly affected by those disasters. And plus there's still issues of gender and disability, inclusive development and things like that still need to be strengthened in those countries. So yeah, if you could just maybe expand on that or even just touch on slightly, particularly aid to middle income countries and the future of that, in your opinion.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just picking up on a point that John made before, I fully agree that often Australian aid doesn't give full appreciation to the power of economic growth to actually lift people out of poverty. And obviously, China's one of the biggest sort of poverty revolutions in the world, and that's purely on economic growth and absolutely nothing to do with development assistance. I think partly they do that not because of lack of appreciation, but again, going back to what I was saying before, in that they don't actually do, and arguably government shouldn't do, economic growth type programs themselves, so they tend not to do it and they tend to underappreciate it. I very much strongly think that economic growth is rapidly overtaking development assistance in terms of its importance in poverty alleviation, and I think that aid needs to be seeing itself as just a part of the Australia-Indonesia relationship. How I do think it will continue to be a part for some time, and probably for precisely the reasons that you're referring to. And I think there's always going to be gaps, just as there are in Australia with the private sector that doesn't cover those gaps. And I think there's going to be really important supplementary programs that donors like Australian government are going to have to do for a really long time. Obviously in Indonesia, they're supporting social